They say every generation believes theirs was simpler. That childhood used to be freer, safer, more real. But memory is a soft light. It blurs the edges, it edits the fear. The 1980s are often remembered as neon colors, Saturday morning cartoons, bikes left on lawns, and doors that stayed unlocked. A time before constant notifications, before the internet became an extension of the nervous system. But beneath the glow of arcade screens and cassette tapes, something quieter was forming. A generation raised between analog and digital, between emotional silence and rising self-expression, between independence and invisibility. What happens to a child who was told to toughen up, but also told they were lucky? What happens to emotions that were never named? What happens when freedom feels real but connection feels distant? And this is not nostalgia. This is excavation. Because behind every era is a psychological climate. And the 1980s left fingerprints on the nervous systems of those who grew up inside it. Let's begin. There is a story often told about childhood in the 1980s. It is bright, sunlit, almost golden. Children riding bicycles until the streetlights flickered on. Hours spent outside without supervision. No smartphones, no constant tracking. No digital noise. It is remembered as freedom, and in many ways it was. But freedom has layers, and sometimes what looks like freedom from a distance feels different from the inside. A child who lets themselves into an empty house after school learns something very specific. Not just how to heat up leftovers, not just how to manage time, but how to be alone. Independence in that era was not always optional. It was assumed, expected, sometimes praised. You're so mature for your age. You can handle it. And so you did. But what happens when handling things becomes your identity? When needing less becomes a quiet badge of honor? The 1980s carried a cultural undercurrent of toughness. Emotions were private. Problems were handled quietly. Parents were often working longer hours. Economic shifts were reshaping households. Divorce rates were rising. Dual-income families were becoming common. Many children adapted. Adaptation is what the nervous system does best. Yet adaptation is not the same as ease. A child left to navigate their own afternoons may appear strong. But strength formed too early can feel like armor. And armor is heavy, even if it fits well. There was also a subtle emotional economy at play. Love was present, yes. Care was present. But it was often practical rather than verbal. Provided rather than expressed. Food on the table. A roof overhead. Rules in place. Security was physical, emotional security was assumed. But assumed does not mean felt. When no one asks how your day really was, you learn to compress it into a sentence. Fine. Good. When no one names your confusion, your anger, your loneliness, you learn to swallow it. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, just quietly. This is the paradox of that decade. So much freedom. So little emotional language. You were allowed to roam neighborhoods, but were you allowed to roam your own feelings? The simplicity often celebrated was logistical, not psychological. There were fewer screens, yes, fewer comparisons, fewer digital distortions. But emotional complexity does not disappear just because technology is absent. It simply hides. Many who grew up in the 1980s carry a calm exterior today. Competent, capable, steady. They solve problems quickly. They rarely panic outwardly. They pride themselves on self-sufficiency. And yet, sometimes beneath that steadiness is a quiet fatigue, a subtle belief it's easier if I just handle it, a hesitation before asking for help, a discomfort with appearing needy because once, long ago, needing less felt safer. Nostalgia paints childhood as simple because children survived it. But survival is not the same as softness. The illusion of simplicity was built on resilience, on adaptation, on learning not to disturb what was already strained. You learn to tie your own shoes early. You learn to entertain yourself. You learned that boredom was yours to solve. And perhaps, without realizing it, You also learned that your inner world was yours to manage alone. There is no accusation here, no blame, only observation, because the glow of memory can coexist with the weight of truth. The 1980s gave you space, but space can feel expansive or empty, and sometimes it was both. There is a particular kind of silence that shapes a child, not the silence of neglect, not the silence of absence, but the silence of expectation. You've got this. The latchkey afternoon became a quiet classroom, an empty house, a television humming in the background, homework spread across the kitchen table. No one hovering, no one checking. Autonomy arrived early, and autonomy can be empowering. It builds competence, problem solving, resourcefulness. Many who grew up in the 1980s became remarkably capable adults. They know how to figure things out. They rarely freeze in uncertainty. They adapt quickly. But the nervous system does not only register independence as empowerment. Sometimes it registers it as responsibility. When you learn young that your needs must wait, that boredom is yours to solve, that fear must be handled internally, something subtle forms. A belief. If I don't do it, no one will. This belief can look like strength. It often is. But it can also become a barrier. As adults, hyper-independence feels natural. Asking for help feels unnatural, almost intrusive. There is discomfort in leaning, attention in relying, because relying implies vulnerability, and vulnerability once felt unnecessary or inconvenient. You learn to tie your emotional shoelaces alone. You learn to self-soothe without witnesses. You learn to solve before you ask. Over time, self-reliance becomes identity, the dependable one, the calm one, the one who handles things. But what happens when you are tired? When the internal reservoir runs low? When you quietly wish someone would notice without being told? Hyper-independence can create a paradox. You crave closeness. But when closeness requires need, you retreat. You tell yourself, it's easier this way. Easier to manage alone. Easier to not owe anyone. Easier to stay in control. Control feels safe when unpredictability shaped your early world. The 1980s rewarded resilience. It celebrated toughness. It admired those who didn't complain. And so you adapted beautifully. But somewhere inside, there may still be a child who carried more than they realized. And self-reliance is not a flaw. It is a skill. But a skill practiced too early can become a reflex. And reflexes are powerful. They protect, even when protection is no longer needed. There is something psychologically unique about being raised in a world that no longer exists. You remember life before the internet, before algorithms curated attention, before every thought had an audience. Your childhood memories are not stored in cloud servers. They live in photo albums, in fading film, in stories retold at family tables. Identity, in those early years, formed in relative privacy. Mistakes were local. Embarrassments faded. Reinvention was possible. There was no permanent digital archive of adolescence. No visible metrics measuring popularity. No constant comparison to strangers across continents. But then the world changed. Slowly at first. Dial-up tones. Desktop computers in shared rooms. Then faster. Smartphones, social media. Permanent connectivity. You were old enough to remember life without it. Young enough to be expected to adapt to it. This in-between position created a quiet tension. Part of you values privacy deeply. You are cautious about oversharing. There is a discomfort in broadcasting emotions publicly. Attention feels earned, not demanded. And yet the modern world rewards visibility. It encourages personal branding. It equates presence with relevance. You learn to exist without being watched. Now you live in a world that constantly watches. For many who grew up in the 1980s, this shift feels subtly destabilizing. There is nostalgia not just for simplicity, but for anonymity, for the ability to exist without performance. You built your early identity offline, through face-to-face friendships, through boredom, through imagination unmediated by screens. Boredom, in fact, was fertile ground. It forced creativity. It demanded internal exploration. It allowed your mind to wander without interruption. Today, wandering is interrupted by notifications. There is also a generational resilience in this transition. You know how to disconnect. You know how to exist without constant stimulation. Your nervous system remembers stillness. But adaptation has been required again and again, from rotary phones to smartphones, from handwritten letters to instant messages, from privacy to exposure. Each shift asks the same quiet question: can you keep up? And you did. But sometimes keeping up comes at a cost, a subtle fatigue, a longing for slowness, a sense that something essential was lost in translation. You belong to both worlds, and sometimes belonging to both means fully belonging to neither. The analog past shaped your foundations. The digital present reshapes your identity. And in the space between those two eras, a quiet psychological balancing act continues. They say adaptability is strength. And it is. But rarely do they speak about the exhaustion that comes with constant adaptation. Growing up in the 1980s meant witnessing acceleration, economic shifts, cultural redefinitions, technological revolutions, entire industries dissolving and reappearing in unfamiliar forms. The ground kept moving. Careers that once seemed stable began to look uncertain. Traditional roles blurred, expectations evolved. The rules changed quietly and then suddenly. And each time the world shifted, you adjusted. You learned new systems, new language, new rhythms. You watched authority structures transform. Parenting styles soften. Social norms invert. Conversations once whispered become public debates. Flexibility became a survival trait. But beneath flexibility, something else formed. A subtle equation. My value depends on how well I keep up. The nervous system does not differentiate between opportunity and threat when change is constant. It simply registers instability. It scans for what might disappear next. And so you became vigilant, responsible, prepared, aware. Many who grew up in this era carry a quiet fear of falling behind. Even when stable, even when accomplished, there is an internal whisper. Stay relevant. Stay useful. Because irrelevance once felt dangerous, and the world rewarded those who adapted quickly. It praised productivity. It celebrated hustle. And so you learned to evolve without complaint. But evolution is not neutral. It requires shedding, letting go, relearning. How many times have you had to reinvent yourself? How many times did you tell yourself, this is just how it is now? Adaptation became normal. Rest became secondary. And over time, constant adaptation can blur identity. When you are always adjusting, when do you pause long enough to ask who you are without the adjustment? The pressure was rarely spoken. It did not announce itself loudly. It appeared as ambition, as responsibility, as maturity. But beneath ambition can live anxiety. Beneath responsibility can live fear. Fear of becoming obsolete. Fear of not keeping pace. Fear of losing footing in a world that does not slow down. You became skilled at learning new rules, but perhaps no one asked how it felt to keep relearning them. Adaptability is strength, but strength practiced continuously without rest becomes strain. And strain, when quiet, can last for years. There is a subtle contradiction that lives inside many who grew up in the 1980s. You value closeness, but you struggle with exposure. You want connection, but you are wary of dependency. You were raised to be steady, to solve, to endure, and you became exactly that. Calm in crisis, logical in conflict, measured in response. But emotions are not always logical. They are tidal. They rise without permission. And when you were young, strong emotion often had nowhere to go. Anger was redirected. Sadness was minimized. Fear was reframed as exaggeration. So you learned containment. Containment feels mature. It feels controlled. It earns approval. But containment practiced for decades can become emotional distance, not coldness, not indifference. Distance. You may notice it in subtle ways. Difficulty identifying what you feel until long after the moment has passed. A preference for discussing ideas over discussing pain. A tendency to intellectualize rather than fully inhabit. The mind becomes translator. The body remains unheard. There is also a quiet discomfort with conflict. Not because you fear disagreement, but because emotional intensity feels destabilizing. Raised in environments where emotional expression was brief or uncomfortable, you may instinctively de-escalate. You smooth things over, you withdraw, you rationalize. Because rationality feels safer than rawness. Yet inside, there may be moments of unexpected overwhelm, sudden irritation, unexplained sadness, a heaviness that seems disproportionate. These are not weaknesses, they are stored fragments. Emotions that once had no witness resurfacing without language. When vulnerability was rarely modeled, it becomes difficult to practice. You may crave someone who can read you without explanation, who understands without you having to unravel. But unraveling feels foreign, perhaps even dangerous. The paradox deepens. You are strong, but sometimes you feel unseen. You are independent, but sometimes you feel alone. You are composed, but sometimes you wish you could fall apart safely. Emotional distance is not the absence of feeling. It is protection learned early, protection that once made sense, a protection that kept the peace, protection that preserved stability. But protection does not always evolve on its own. And sometimes the hardest part is admitting there is something beneath the calm surface that has never fully been spoken.